Hello and welcome to the third episode of Insider Information, a series that aims to delve into aspects of the economy that I'm sure you've heard of, but might not know the full extent of. I'm your usual host and clueless outsider to the world of economics, Jin'taan, and with me today is Caleb of the Invisible Exchequer, my guide to the esoteric world of economics. But before we push on to our main topic, which is how to read the MER and understanding what it's about, we have a word from our shiny new sponsor, PushX. PushX is, as I mentioned in our previous episode, the hauling service that I use for all of my personal freight. And whilst I could talk about the many wonderful soft features they have, like the fact that they'll send you a mail when your package arrives, or that they offer a range of different rates for different sizes, from the extra small stuff you could pack in an interceptor, to the max load of a max-skilled freighter. The main thing I know you guys are going to be interested in is cost. And PushX, well, it wins that every time. Trips from Jitter to MER are 80% of the cost of the most well-known hauling brand, and, thanks to a generous offer, you can get 10% back on the cost of your hauling contract by using the code JIN, that's J-I-N, in your contract description for the next 2 weeks. And remember, don't just move it, push it. There you go. Do you like the ad read?
Oh, I love that one. It's very close to actual coupons, so...
nothing wrong with
and secret codes and stuff. It's fine.
So the MER is now upon us, Caleb. With its many pretty graphs and statistics. I know that normally, when people kind of talk about this on podcasts and stuff like that, they're talking about it in kind of the context of, oh man, look how much the Imperium is mining. They're gonna get you.
Yeah, that's what it's become, right? It's the Delve leaderboard, and that's what it's been working as for at least 6 months or so. So. Yeah. But the origin is a little bit important, I think. It stems back from when CCP hired an actual economist and did actual financial reporting. I think they were actually quarterly back then, with proper text and analysis and commentary and stuff like that from Dr. Ayok and his team. They were not really amazing, but they were really entertaining, and it felt more like serious economic reporting. But now we got Quant pulling some data for us instead, so we can see the actual raw numbers, and we couldn't do that back then. So
yeah, one of the things that I've always been fascinated about, and kind of why I'm doing this, is that whenever I talk to you or anyone else who's involved in economics, they always seem to be able to look at the MER and just immediately understand what all of the graphs mean. And they don't just see the big things like, oh man, Providence has moved this much stuff out of the region, or man, goons have mined 13 trillion ISK or whatever. You seem to be able to get bigger things from it.
Well, it's because many of the people that are playing EVE for the financial stuff, even the people that actually have no background in it, eventually gets into digging into things like nomenclature and terminologies and how to analyze budgets and stuff like that. And then it just becomes second nature to see these numbers, and it just makes sense to people that work with them all day, right? The joke is, back in the casino war, I don't know if you remember, but I was on talking in stations with the casino owners, and I actually asked one of them what their NAV was, their net asset value. And he didn't even know what NAV was. And that just goes to show that you can do stuff even though you have no background in things like economics and budgeting and stuff like that. I'm just wondering if that proves the whole mobster argument, but that's a different story.
Well, the first graph I suppose I should introduce the section first, actually. We're going to section this off into 3 separate sections. The first section we're going to have is on money supply, talking about what's happening with the overall economy, I guess. The second section is going to be called supply and demand, although Caleb really wanted it to be called war and peace, which is going to be talking about stuff getting destroyed and stuff getting built and kind of the movement between that. And then the final thing we're going to look at, the final section at least, is market forces. So talking about where market trading is going on, where is the money being transferred to, stuff like that. And that's also a part that also has a lot of intel implications, which you'll get onto, I'm sure.
And you've promised me that at some point we're also going to dig into creating a small presentation of the whole Disney Circle of Life thing in EVE Online with the proper musical theme and background and stuff like that. So we can explain things like faucets and sinks and where everything is coming from. So we might actually avoid some of all the mistakes that people make when they say that something is a faucet when it's actually not at all.
Do you mean just a guide to terminology?
Yeah, because many people think that things are faucets or sinks that actually aren't. Like when prices go up, that is actually a faucet, a sink, but it's really usually not. It's only a sink in the term that some of it is actually taxed out. The money is not actually disappearing anyway.
All right, well, if you want to take a look at these graphs in slightly more detail than is shown in the video here, you can take a look at the description. I have bullet pointed every single graph, and I will try and use the numbers to refer to them when we come to them. So let's bring up graph 1.1, which is sinks versus faucets overall. And this kind of shows where all the money comes from and goes in terms of raw risk in EVE. And the things that always really stand out to me is just how enormously huge the two main faucets are, which is bounty prizes and commodities, which is mostly blue loot from what I know. Wormhole stuff. And that's 80% of all the ISK that comes into the game.
Pretty much. And this also shows the whole problem that's kind of old now, that there's always been a little bit of a problem trying to get a good balance, because the player base will just hit those faucets instantly, and, well, Delve is the proof in the pudding, right?
Mm-hmm.
The important, one of the important sets of data in that first graph is actually the ISK delta, which is a little bit esoteric. It's how active accounts, either reactivated accounts or lapsing accounts, are not counted in the money supply. It also includes things like bans. So when you get an extremely high negative ISK delta, that's usually because either people have quit like 30 days ago, or because they've actually been banned.
Yeah, I mean, I actually did some looking into this, and it seems like 62 trillion ISK was removed by non-noted sinks, so GM action and inactivity, this month.
You just noticed that recently the security team was on one of the shows, and they said that there had actually been a lot of activity in things like bans, and I think they even announced the numbers. So we know that there's been a recent number of bans. But what you should do is you should actually do what the MER is for, because you get the raw data. So you should go in and then check when the ISK delta is positive and when it's negative, and then do an actual proper average over time. I think we calculated it to, was it negative 2 trillion or something like that per month over time, I think.
I gotta say that flew a little over my head, but hopefully people in the audience got it. I'm just astounded by the scale of it.
It's not always negative. It's not always negative. It's positive when new players are, when old players are reactivating their accounts, or existing players are activating further accounts.
It can also be positive if people are just making a lot more money than they're spending.
Not on deltas. The delta is how it calculates what comes in and what goes out of the actual game on account-wise.
Oh, really? Okay. Right, yeah. I didn't know that.
It's a different number.
I thought it was the sum total of the noted faucets and sinks, and then that was just saying, here's what the total is after we add in the stuff that we're not telling you, like inaction and bans.
No,
okay,
that one
cool.
is based on actual accounts.
You see, you learn something new every day.
It's quite a useful little piece of data.
Yeah, are there any other interesting parts of this graph that you want to talk about?
Not in that first one. That's the main one. It's the fact that and then of course that you can see pretty much the volume of money coming in and the money going out of the game. Hence the whole sinks and faucets.
All right. In that case, let's take a look at graph 1.2, which is the faucets in historical context, where we can see just how ridiculously high bounties have climbed over the past 3 or 4 years.
I think what a graph like that can actually show you is something about activity levels. It's very useful to see how players are behaving. That's mostly what that's used for.
Okay, so what can you read from this graph then? If you can say that gives you an idea of activity, what kind of activity does that represent?
Well, you would expect something like a drop off in the faucets when activity levels in the game make some players unable to actually be at the faucet, right? So things like war, or then of course seasonal decline because of inactivity. You see the same in the concurrent players. If you look at Crippus, EVE Offline, you see these patterns, and they're interesting, not so much in this resolution, but they're interesting in that they are opposite of real life seasonal activities. Because of course, when you're off, you're potentially playing EVE, and the other way around, when you're actively doing something in the real world, you can't actually play EVE. So something like the weekly dynamics in real life, it's actively buying in on Monday, then it's positioning Wednesday, and then it's offloading on Friday. So you are ready with liquid money again on Monday, right? In EVE, it's the other way around. It's Thursday that you start maybe peaking and buying in, and then you're ready in the actual weekend, and then you're selling off, so you're ready for the next weekend, right? So market is open in weekend in EVE Online compared to in work days in real life.
I've actually never thought of that. That's actually very fun. So one thing that's always interested me when I look at this graph is just how flat everything seems to be. It feels like a lot of these things don't change, like year on year. With the exception of bounty prizes, everything else just seems to be relatively static. Yeah. There's a couple of billion in either here and there, but
the fluctuations are minor. The only thing that's really steady and growing is the actual money supply, and I think that's in the next graph.
Yep, that is. In fact, that is graph 1.3, which is the overall ISK supply, which shows us kind of the rate of change of ISK in the game. And as you can see, it's been steadily going up since as far as the graph starts from, but as you can see, it's flattened out.
Summing up the things that we've talked about, right? So this is the graph that shows how much money is in the game in total. So how is it moving? With the inclination of the graph is actually the velocity of money coming into the game. So if you do a little bit of number crunching, you should get something like 2 to 3% growth each month. Which is funny because that's pretty much the same range of price for loans. So it's kind of interesting that you actually have a 0% loan effectively.
That is very interesting, actually. So one of the things that's notable about this, however, is that we've basically seen a flattening of the money supply here. The rate of change has gone.
To the activities of the faucet, right? So when players are doing something actively that makes it impossible for them to actually generate ISK by sucking at the faucets, things like bounties and stuff like that, then you will see that flattening. And you usually see that when there's a war. Sometimes it actually also crashes a little bit down and goes negative, right?
So what you're saying is that you can actually kind of get a sense of like what's going on politically from the economic standpoint.
Yeah, and you can also tell something about things like patches and stuff like that. Because one of the things that is noticeable is that when new stuff comes into the game, so like blueprints, then players need to actually buy those blueprints. And because that's supplied by NPCs, then when you spend the ISK that is in the ISK supply in the game to convert that into blueprints, you will actually see a dip. And usually that's the dips that you see on the graph. That's when a lot of blueprints are purchased or similar things service-wise is activated with the NPCs.
Yeah, the only other major dips are attributed to the banning of two major gambling sites, SomaBlink and iWannIsk.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's kind of talking about where the money's coming from. Now let's look at a little more of an interesting graph, and the graphs I think a lot of people tend to focus on, which is supply and demand. We're going to start with 2.1, which is the destruction map, which is where everything in EVE blows up. And I gotta say that I just have to note, because of like the contemporary events that are going on right now, this does not include burn jitter. This is the last month.
Yeah.
The jitter and the surrounding area. Yeah, jitter and the surrounding area is just this dangerous. And more shit gets destroyed in the Forge than any other region in the game.
And both this and the topic we just touched upon is one of the reasons I'm a little bit sad that CCP has not actually figured out how to make a site, a mini website for the MER, so you can have things like being able to go back to the former months of the same types of graphs, and maybe even have some combination graphs. So, of course, all the nerds are doing this manually with the raw data, but it would just be a nice added value to be able to see this, even if you're not necessarily inclined to sit there and do that yourself.
So what kind of information can you glean from this graph, though? What or infographic? I guess it's technically not a graph, is it?
Right now, it's just the map, right? You're just able to see the regions that have the highest level of activity.
So is that all it tells you, just where people are and where they're doing things?
Well, if we're looking at 2.1, this is just basically saying where is the value being destroyed. And it's, of course, also an indicator of where the population is, because it's not very likely that a low population area is going to have high destruction values, unless, of course, it's going to be offset by what's being destroyed. So you could get a little bit of some strange numbers if, say, big fleets of Supers and Titans get destroyed in a specific fight, for instance.
Yeah, I do have to say that it's really interesting that Delve has as much losses as Providence, whilst Providence is in the process of being evicted. It kind of just shows the scale of people that are active in Delve right now.
Oh, yeah.
Alright, well with that, let's take a look at a graph that I literally have no idea how to read, which is 2.2, production versus destruction. Take it away, Caleb.
This is one of those where it requires a little bit of more habit into reading graphs, because this is a lot like things like weather, temperature and carbon dioxide and things like that. So you will see that when you get a lot of destruction, then you should see a lot of production following just afterwards, right? It's because either it's preparation for the destruction levels or it's recuperation of the destruction levels. So you get this leading or lagging phenomenon, really.
So that lets you... So you can use that to predict when stuff is going to come onto the market, because you can see when destruction's happened.
Kind of. You can see where things are trending. So you would be able to see things like what intensity is a conflict having in the game, and is the production able to follow and recuperate those losses. If the production numbers looks like they're low compared to the destruction numbers, there's actually going to be a lack of items in the market, and you would expect a price rise in general.
And that's something that you, as a speculative trader, can exploit.
Yeah, it would be. But we have a little bit of a problem, because some of these data sets have had issues with what was being calculated and whether or not they were showing citadels as well as the NPC stations. So it's been a little bit tricky to actually know exactly how precise any of these graphs are.
Mm-hmm. Although you do have the raw data to kind of work with to some degree.
Oh, yeah. But like with, it's a bit like the fact that any contract sales are not calculated in the market activities. So this is what offsets a lot of nullsec, because nullsec is very internalized markets. So that means that most of it is handled through contracts. That means that it never hits the public STC market.
We're slowly seeing people start to move away from that a little bit, but the convenience of contracts is just too hard to beat for most people, I think.
Yeah, and it's also because there is huge benefit from using the STC market, but most players don't actually have their character trained to have enough orders available. So if they haven't trained the market skills, they will only have 17 orders available compared to 300. And if you're an active trader, then 300 is potentially not really that useful. If you want to be actively trading for an entire region, then you can't actually do that from one character. You need a lot of alts.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Especially if you're like one man armying it, it's gonna be hard.
Yeah, and it's just a logistical nightmare because you have to balance the number of orders and then how it's if you want to trade a specific item, right, you need to both be selling it and buying it with a price difference, right? But when you then look at how many items are available in the game now, just if you want to cover something like, say, you want to set up a shop where you are servicing all the raw ore, right? Then you have all the variants as well. So you end up needing...
And probably the compressed variants because of raw cores and stuff like that.
Then it's 120 if you want to trade all of it. So it's just because of the complexity that's been developing in EVE and all that growth, the number of items that you can trade or needs to trade if you want to specialize, even if you just want to do things like ore and minerals, you need something more in the realm of like 500 orders if you want to actually be able to cover it.
This is probably something that we can get into when we talk about the market forces a little later as well.
Yeah, I just skipped that.
No, it's very interesting, so don't apologize at all. But let's, before we get on to that, take a look at the final graph. Well, the penultimate graph in this section, which is 2.3, mining by region, which is basically where Aerith gets to stand and chest beat on every platform he gets about how good Delve is, because Delve is the clear winner. I don't think there's any competition anymore.
Look at all my little robots.
It's unreal, and this is actually one of the times when I felt it was necessary to create my own graph. So I went and created graph 2.3.1, which is a graph of the delta, and this shows kind of the growth of all regions and how much the industry is coming together for people. And as you can see, it's ridiculous. You know, goons are up 5 trillion.
And it's so nice that you made that graph, because it kind of proves one of the points I've been making recently, that, well, of course, it's not entirely dead because slumlords is a thing, but the rental model is a thing of the past. There's no future in something like that, because there's just too much real estate out there. So how are you going to force people to pay you rent for something that they can just get as a service elsewhere? And it basically proves that doing that whole micro lot Irish potato farming instead of the Delve vertical farming and robot farming, it makes no sense. You can't compete. You need to organize and do things the same way that they do in Delve. And this is being done to some extent elsewhere. It's just that it's not as noticeable because it's not on the same scale, because you have these 3 factors of the Imperium working hand in hand. You have the organizational level, you have the population numbers, and then you have the CCP design of anomalies being infinitely spawnable. So you can basically vertically farm, which is what is actually happening in Delve. I think Aerith said that they only, with the number of people they have now, they actually only need like 3 constellations.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an incredible amount of player density that the game can support. And that's, yeah.
It's a high-rise vertical farm. That's what it is. And it's also, it's not because I want to destroy the game for anyone, But one of the worst designs in the game is actually the capability of just putting more and more goons into one little hole and then just farming money.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying that the renters need to have some sort of green revolution?
No, but if there is that infinite scalability vertically, right? If you can fit so many goons into so little space, then splitting space up and renting it out in smaller lots where you are only utilizing like 3%, 4% of capacity, that makes no sense. That's just not effective.
Yeah, we've talked about this, and we've kind of discussed about having this as a topic at some point, which is talking about how, basically, why Delve is able to mine so much, and talking about time utility and stuff like that, and me getting really nerdy about, like, kind of rationalizing concepts like that. But,
yeah, and I know from an ecological standpoint, I'm a little bit of an ecosystem freak, right? What I would like to see is something that resembles real life. So you can't just keep farming the same field infinitely at maximum yield, because if you do that, it's going to die, and you are going to actually need to nurture it, or you're going to have to need to fallow it, right? This is kind of what we need in a game. We need, and interestingly, this is exactly what that massively brilliant design of Lifeblood has actually brought. The new mining platforms are maybe the most innovative thing in game design when it comes to resource faucets.
So for those listening, you're talking about the moon mining and the moon fracking. Yeah.
Because it's controlled by players and it's destructible. That if you compare this to any other game where a node is just infinitely respawning and it respawns based on basically time, right? And then you have things like Anomaly that actually respawns based on player activity. This is just not good. What Lifeblood does is it hands the control of the timing to the players, but the node can be destroyed by other players, which is extremely dynamic, and it just will eventually balance itself.
It's a very cool take on Lifeblood. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're actually... Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
It's one of those remarkable Icelandic, oops, I did a good thing.
I think that describes a lot of Eve, is, oops, I made a good mechanic.
That's exactly what they are living on, right? It's their lifeblood, the fact that they keep coming up with these novel ideas that just resolve something that no one else has actually cracked. It's also why they still have so many unique selling points and specific CCP designs in Eve, and potentially also in the other brands that no one else seems to be able to just really copy, and they haven't done it, even though we've had 50 MMO titles out there, and they can't really do anything remotely like what Eve does.
Yeah, I've always found one of the most fun things about working with CCP is their inability to do anything the easy way.
Which is also why they actually have a product that's survived for 15 years now without actually being broken. Many people think that I've also talked a lot about things that are kind of broken in Eve and things like the scarcity thing, but fundamentally it's still working, and that's even taking into consideration what I told you in the other video, I think, about demographics, that in a growing population you have a very nice productive growth economy. When you've got one that's flattening or declining, you get the problem of the Japanese model, and that's
also the pensions model, and like every other model which assumes infinite growth and then realizes that growth isn't infinite.
Yeah, and it's also why if you have a design that is not insulated for such things, if you don't have a good faucet sinks design, then because most MMOs all explode in growth and then they hit a peak because of this whole exponential design in every aspect of their design mechanics, right? So things like their nodes and stuff like that. Then what you get is you get this crazy inflationary economy and ecosystem, and then it peaks and then it crashes, and then everyone fucks off because nothing is worth anything anymore, and it's not really fun because it's all just faceless grinding.
All right, well, with faceless grinding on the mind, let's take a look at Section 3, Market Forces, and our first graph, which is Market Trade by Region. And this is one that you picked out as being particularly kind of important. And I want to know why you thought it was so.
Because it shows one of the things that's still a little bit of a problem. Of course, it's a natural development that people actually like convenience, so they will focus most of their trade in one location. And then, so you got this extreme Jita-centric economy in Eve, and we just touched upon the thing with how the ability to actually create minor hubs in small groups is actually almost impossible because of things like the limitation thing of market orders. But it shows that people will then choose to use things like contracts instead, and that's why it shows that Delve is such a small number compared to Jita. And
I do find it interesting though that Delve is about half of what a MER is overall.
Well, again, it's difficult to really make sense of it because we do not know the shadow numbers, right? We do not know the volume traded in contracts in Delve, and I would actually warrant that it's not on par with Jita, of course, but it's at least 5 to 10 times the number that you're seeing visibly on the SEC market.
So you heard that. CCP, please let us see contracts in market trade value.
We kind of need it, right? Because otherwise, potentially half of the market is missing, and it's also because other markets that are even more shadowy. Because Delve is actually developing a public market, actively doing so, and even considering doing off hubs and things like that. So. Because they need to bind the regions together in an effective way, and when you have safe travels with jump freighters and things like that, it's actually really useful. The thing that's really missing is some sort of policy of competition. Right now, they're still working on slightly communist plan economics, but of course, that's the development of a group that size.
All right, well. With that, let's take a look at 3.2, which is trade balance per region. And this is something that I know a little bit about, but I wanted you to take us through it first.
Well, I think my comment to that is that the reason that you know a little bit about this is because to me it's actually useless.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a military intel tool. This basically, exactly. For those of you who don't know, this shows all exports, and that includes things like, for example, super fleets. So you can use this to say, oh, it looks like Delve is down X%, X trillion more than I expected it to, and Fountain is up X trillion more than I expected it to. That means they've probably moved their super fleet to Fountain during this month, and therefore I know where their super fleet is, and have a rough estimation of how big it is. Although that's really, really bad, and you shouldn't try and do that. You should just get intel on that if you can.
Yeah, and I have suggested that I would prefer two alternative solutions, right? One would be you do not actually count the value of a hull that moves from space to space. You only calculate the cargo, right? The other is that if you want to then do the whole, well, some people are actually flying and selling their hull. So it does have some relevance market-wise if people are actually moving their ship to sell it. But that's a really low number. So my argument would be, if there is a rig, you do not count it at all.
There we go. Another CCP please in this episode.
Because that would also mean that you would not be able to use it as an intel tool at all. It would only be a market and an economic tool, right? Yeah. And even better, you could say that maybe it should only calculate. It shouldn't calculate all these rare things and assemble things, right? Maybe it should just calculate things that are used in another blueprint. So it wouldn't actually count any hulls above T1.
Yeah. Well, this is actually the graph that sparked a lot of controversy and actually brought a lot more attention to the MER, as it's one that Arith, during his time in the CSM, which he's still currently part of, I didn't mean to imply that he's dead or something.
It's a horrible data set that you're basically giving away potential troop movement, right?
Yeah, that was his concern with it. That's what he said. It was his concern with it at the time. I'm told. I was actually at that time. I was sleeping on the '07 set, feeling very, very sorry for myself because we'd been out drinking very late the night before, and I decided that I probably wasn't gonna have much input on the economy session.
Well, maybe there's a variable missing from hulls that when you assemble a ship, maybe it should have a data set that says where you assembled it.
Oh, I know people have been asking for stuff like that for years, and more specifically for like who made that hull. Like, you know,
yeah, but that's a vanity thing.
I know.
What I'm referring to is the fact that you would be able to then have things like origin of creation in things like kill mails, right? That means that you could do something similar to this type of intel, but it wouldn't mess up things like markets.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Well, so you're saying, effectively, your kind of read on these market graphs is that none of them are particularly useful for you in your trading.
All of them are, maybe except for this one. Because this one is so offset by troop movement or war efforts that it doesn't really give you a good number on actual imports and exports. And that means that I can't say anything about trade balances between regions or things like that. And then again, back to some of the other things, because of infinite self-sufficiency, things like anomalies respawning, all of that, there's really no incentive to trade much between neutral or even enemy neighbors, right? So balance of payment is not really a thing. There is some between null entities and JITA, but again, nothing across. And this is a design flaw. But of course, some will say, well, we don't want that. Well, we kind of need that because that's going to be the incentive to actually go and shoot your neighbor because they have something you want.
The golden rule of Eve is, I want it, therefore I'm going to shoot you.
Yeah, except now, I want it, therefore I'm going to undock my Rourke and suck a lot of Roid and make it.
Yeah, so you're saying that there's no scarcity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's been your argument for a very long time.
It has.
But it's nice to hear it.
It's just because it used to be a thing when we had a very steep growth in population. That means that we could not really keep up with the demand side, right? So we had something that looked like a very healthy economy, but there were still design flaws that couldn't actually make up for that. And then when you started flattening out, so you didn't have that increased demand all the time, then it just became obvious that scarcity was not actually built in that well in need. But with lifeblood, potentially that could come back because there is an over representation of wolves to sheep in EVE at the moment. So if they start putting in these limiting factors, you would see a very interesting scarcity development very fast.
A scarcity of sheep, you're saying?
Yeah, because there's not a lot. There's not enough. Potentially.
Predator-based economies. That's actually that's an interesting way to put EVE. Actually, I think that's, if you see all of the empires in EVE as actually like economies unto themselves, then EVE is already a predator economy. Your whole point is to attack other predators and take their shit before they attack you and take your shit.
So some will say that it's very lucky that we have the Imperium to supply all the raw materials that's needed to actually keep EVE running. Otherwise, people would actually need to start fighting for it.
So basically, you're saying the Imperium is the bringer of world peace.
Kind of. They are the grain storage, pretty much like America is in real life.
Oh, I can't wait to tell it. I can't wait for Arif to hear that. That's great. I'm sure he'll be overjoyed to hear you say that.
I'm sure some will actually say that they are more like the oil production of the Middle East, but that's just a statement of policy.
Can't run your tanks if you ain't got no oil to run them.
Yeah, but you can't fucking man your tanks unless you've got some wheat to feed them.
True stories. Gotta be fed bread and lead. Well, before this goes on to any deeper of a tangent, I think we should probably sign this one off. This has been a really interesting episode, Caleb. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, I just hope at some point someone will come on and start correcting me.
You do a great job. You do far better than I would on my own, which is why you're here. Well, do you have anything else to add about the MER before we go?
Not anything that I haven't already put in the prior segments, so I think I'm fine.
All right, well, thank you everyone for listening, and fly smart.